Okay, here we go. So this is basically the first lecture for this course. In this video, we're going to be covering most of chapter 2. I'll cover the rest of chapter 2 in the next video. This chapter is about supply and demand. The stuff I'm going to cover in the next video is just the stuff on elasticity. Okay, so let's get into it. So first, we're going to make a couple of assumptions. I say 4, but it's actually kind of 5. So we're going to focus on a single market, right? So when we're looking at supply and demand of something, it'll be the market for, say, apples or cars or something. It won't be a more general market for apples and cars and all sorts of things. So we're going to keep it to one good at a time. We're going to assume these goods are homogeneous. So all the goods are exactly the same. We're also going to say that all of the goods in the market are going to be sold at the same price. Consumers and producers both have the same information and they have all the correct information, so perfect information. And then, of course, we're going to have many producers and consumers. So these assumptions probably look fairly familiar to you. These are, kind of standard assumptions for perfect competition, which is kind of the realm we're going to stay in for at least the bulk of this course. Okay, so starting with demand. So you're all familiar with the law of demand from Econ 201. And it says that as price increases, quantity demanded decreases, right? And so this is going to give us the downward sloping demand curve that we know about. That's depicted in the graph here. Just so that we know, the demand curve is telling us how much consumers are willing to buy of some good at a given price, right? So if the price is $5, the demand curve will tell us the quantity that will be demanded at that price. So that's what the demand curve is telling us. So demand can move in a bunch of different ways. We're talking about shifters here. In this case, a change in price will be a movement along the demand curve. So that's not a shift in demand. That's not a change in demand. It's a change in quantity demanded. But here are some of the demand shifters that we're going to talk about in this course. So the number of consumers. So if a bunch of consumers enter a market, that's going to increase demand. Income shocks. So for normal goods, if incomes rise, that will increase the quantity people want of that good. So that'll be an increase in demand. If it's an inferior good, the opposite will be true. Tastes and preferences. If for some reason people will decide they like a certain good more all of a sudden, that will increase demand. The opposite will be true if they decide they dislike a good all of a sudden. Prices of complements and substitutes, right? So complements, peanut butter and jelly are complements. If the price of jelly rises, that's going to increase the cost of making a total peanut butter and jelly sandwich. So an increase in the price of the complement to jelly will decrease the quantity people will buy of peanut butter. So price of jelly goes up, quantity of peanut butter bought will go down. And of course, substitutes. So Coca-Cola and Pepsi are substitutes. If the price of Pepsi goes way down, people will buy less Coca-Cola because they'll be switching from Coke to Pepsi because they're pretty good substitutes. Okay, so here's just a simple example of how a demand curve will shift, a real world example. So we've seen immigration to Texas. So if we think about the market for homes, immigration to Texas is going to be an increase in the consumers in the market for homes in Texas. And so that's just going to shift our demand curve to the right here. So we just see a move from D0, the blue line, to the green line, D1. A second example, and I'm just making this up, if a new study found that Oreos can cause cancer, that would probably decrease the demand for Oreos. And so we just see a leftward shift in the demand curve for Oreos from D0 to D1 there. And again, most of this in this lecture should be review. So I'm covering it fairly quickly, and hopefully it is a review for most of you. Okay, let's move on to supply. So as we know, the law of supply says that as the price increases, quantity supplied also increases. right? So think about if you were a seller selling maybe baked goods or something. If you normally sold cookies for $1, but then all of a sudden you were able to sell cookies for $2, that would probably encourage you to sell more cookies, so you would increase your supply or your quantity supplied. And so this is why we see this upward direction of the supply curve, this upward sloping supply curve. Yeah. Okay, so just like demand, we have things that will shift our supply curve. So the first one is number of producers, right? So if we, again, are selling cookies and 3 more people enter the market for selling cookies, that's going to be an increase in supply. If people leave the market, that's a decrease in supply. Seller expectations can influence the supply curve. People may enter and exit the market based on their expectations. And cost of productions is a big one here, and that can be a number of things. So natural disasters. So think about a drought that would drastically increase the cost of producing some sort of farm good. Or even if a natural disaster blocked a road or something like that, that would increase the cost of transporting goods. So that kind of all falls under the cost of production. Technological progress is kind of on the opposite end of this because it will decrease the cost of production. Newer technology makes it cheaper to produce products, right? So if we come up with better farm equipment for farming apples or something, then it will be cheaper to produce apples. And so that will be a rightward shift of the supply curve. And then price of inputs obviously is going to shift the supply curve. All right, so if farm equipment becomes more expensive for some reason, then purchasing that farm equipment in order to buy or in order to produce whatever you're farming is going to cause a leftward shift or an inward shift of the supply curve. It'll decrease your supply. So just a couple examples. A drought hits Florida, destroying orange farms. So this is going to be a leftward shift to supply for oranges. Yeah, because, if their farms get destroyed or, decimated by a drought, it will affect their ability to produce oranges. And then let's just say the price of computer chips decreases. Thinking about the market for just computers, this will increase our supply of computers because it'll be cheaper to produce computers because the input, computer chips, has decreased. Okay, so now that we've got supply and demand, we can put them together to get equilibrium. So equilibrium is the price at which the quantity supplied equals the quantity demanded, right? So graphically, as you can see, this is just represented where the supply and demand curve cross each other. That's our equilibrium point. We can also think about this mathematically, right? So we can get a demand curve equation and a supply curve equation, and we can use these to determine equilibrium, price and quantity. So I'll work through this quickly. So let's get a pen here. So we have our 2 equations, and I've labeled them supply and demand, but of course, even if I didn't label them, we could know which one is supply and which one is demand. Since we know demand has a downward slope and we see that this equation has a negative slope, we know that that's got to be the demand curve, right? So what we're going to do, since we know in equilibrium the price is equal, what we can do is just set the price equal for both of these. And so we're just going to set these equations equal, right? So we have 100 minus 2Q, and this is QD, but we know quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. So we can kind of dispatch with the subscript D or subscript S. And then we have the supply equation, which is 10 plus 4QS, right? But we, again, can ignore the S and D here because it'll be one and the same in a second. All right, so we just have to solve for Q algebraically. We have 2 equations, one unknown, so we can solve. or one equation, one unknown we can solve. So what I'm going to do is add 2q on both sides. And this will give us 100 is equal to 10 plus 6q. And then we subtract 10 on both sides to give me 90 is equal to 6q. And then finally, we just divide 6, make this look more like a 9. Divide 6 on both sides. 90 divided by 6 should be 15. And that's going to be our equilibrium quantity. So I'll put a star next to that because it's our equilibrium quantity. And so we also might want to find price, our equilibrium price. And so since the price is equal between the demand curve and supply curve at this quantity, we can plug this quantity into either equation and it should give us the same price. So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to plug it in first to the demand curve. So we want to find, box this off. We want to find P when quantity is 15. So we'll just plug a 15 in here in that equation. And so P is equal to 100 minus 30, or this is just 70. And like I said, the supply curve should give us the same thing since this is where the supply and demand curve are equal. So we can plug this same 15 into the supply curve and it should give us the same price. So again, we're just going to look for the price in this second equation, the supply curve, when our quantity is 15. So we just plug in 15 there. And so we get P equals 10 plus 4 times 15 is 60. So again, that's going to give us a price of $70. Okay. And since they match up, that's a good sign. We know we did everything right. Okay. Now moving on. So it's important to understand why we get to equilibrium, why it is that markets settle at that point where supply and demand are equal. And so one way to think about this is to say, well, what happens if the price is above equilibrium? What happens then? Why wouldn't it settle at a price above equilibrium? And so we can think about this. And so if we set a price, this dashed line here, above our equilibrium point, this will give us a quantity supplied, QS, that is greater than our quantity demanded, QD here. And what that means is we have a surplus, right? So our quantity supplied being greater than our quantity demanded means we have a surplus. And a surplus is essentially there are goods left on the shelf that aren't being bought by people at that price. And so what do firms do when they have unsold goods? Well, they put those goods on sale, right? So in other words, they lower their price in response to a surplus to get rid of those excess goods. And so they'll lower the price until they reach equilibrium. And so we say that a surplus will put downward pressure on the market until you get to equilibrium. And so you could think, okay, so what about a price that's set below equilibrium? Right, so we're going to have a similar situation. It's just going to be flipped a little bit. In this case, we're going to have quantity demanded, QD, greater than quantity supplied, QS. Right, and so this is more people want goods than goods are available. Right, so in other words, people are going to the store to buy a certain good, and it's not on the shelf because too many people want that good at that specific price. Right, and so what people will do in response to this, what buyers will do, is they'll bid up the price in response to this, and they'll bid up the price until we reach equilibrium where everybody who wants this good at the equilibrium price will be able to get it, right? So that the market will clear. And so we say a shortage will put upward pressure on the market here. Okay, and so that's why we settle at equilibrium, because if we're not at equilibrium, we either have upward or downward pressure on the market until we get to that point. Okay, so one of the last things we're going to talk about is how shifts in demand change our equilibrium point. So we can have shifts in demand, and that's what we'll talk about first. And then we'll do shifts in supply, and then we'll do both together. Okay, so first we could have an increase in demand. So I've shown that in this graph. So our new demand curve is going to be this D1. And so we can find a new equilibrium point, this purple point, where that crosses the original supply curve or the only supply curve. And at this purple point, we have a higher price and a higher quantity. So we can say that an increase in demand will increase price and increase quantity, all else equal, or without changing anything else. So what about a decrease in demand? Well, that's going to have the exact opposite effect. Again, we're going to start at this original demand, D0, this green demand, shift it to the left to get this new demand, the black line, D1. And then that will give us a new equilibrium point. Again, the purple dot, that's at a lower price and a lower quantity. So we can say a decrease in demand, all things equal, is going to decrease price and decrease quantity. Moving on to supply. So if now we're going to hold our demand curve constant and just change our supply. So let's first start with an increase in supply. We can see again, this is just going to give us a new supply curve that's shifted over to the right. And this will give us a new equilibrium point. At this new point, we have a lower price, but a higher quantity. So we can say an increase in supply decreases price and increases quantity, all things equal. And then finally, the opposite effect. When we decrease our supply, we're going to have a leftward shift in our supply curve, giving us this new black supply curve and a new equilibrium point that has a higher price and a lower quantity. So a decrease in supply is going to increase our price and decrease our quantity, all things equal. And so finally, we can put this all together to look at what a supply and a demand shift is going to do to our equilibrium point, and see the end result on our price and quantity. Okay, so first we're going to have a decrease in supply. So it's just going to look like this. We're going to get this new supply curve, S1, and then we're going to increase our demand, giving us this new demand curve. And now that we have a new demand and a new supply curve, we can get a new equilibrium point. And we see that the new equilibrium point is definitely a higher price, but we're not quite sure what's happened to the quantity. It kind of looks about the same, maybe a little lower. And so what we need to do is break down the effects. So we see that the decrease in supply, we know from the previous slides that a decrease in supply is going to increase price and decrease quantity. And we also know that an increase in demand is going to increase price and increase quantity. So if we want to know what happens to price, we can just add the two effects on price. And so we see that for price, we had a positive effect because of the decrease in supply on price, and a positive effect because of the increase in demand on price. And so if we add two positives together, that has to give us a positive effect. So overall, the decrease in supply and increase in demand is going to unambiguously increase our price. Now, when we look at quantity, it's going to be a little different, because when we're looking at the effect of the decrease in supply on our quantity, we know that the decreased supply is going to decrease our quantity, and the increase in demand is going to increase our quantity. So we're adding a negative plus a positive, and if we don't know the magnitude of these effects, we're not going to know the overall effect, because the negative could be bigger than the positive, or the negative could be smaller than the positive. So we could get positive effect, no effect, or negative effect on our quantity here. So we say that it's ambiguous in this case. And so this is where I'm going to cut off this video. I'll have a little concept check for you all. And in the next video, I'm going to cover elasticities, which should also be familiar to you all. Okay, I'll see you in the next video.